Most people imagine empires falling because of bad generals, lost battles, or decadent rulers lounging while enemies close in. But what if the real story is quieter, slower, and far more unsettling? What if the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-lasting empires in human history, did not survive nearly 6 centuries because it was endlessly rich or endlessly victorious, but because it mastered something far less glamorous: the art of paying for war without collapsing? And what if the very system that allowed the Ottomans to fight for so long also planted the seeds of their eventual unraveling? The mystery is not how the Ottomans fought so many wars. The mystery is how they afforded them, generation after generation, across continents, while rivals burned through treasuries and imploded. To understand that, we have to unlearn some comfortable assumptions about money, power, and empire. The Ottoman story begins at the edge of the known world, in a frontier zone where survival depended on violence, flexibility, and speed. In the late 13th century, the Ottoman state was not an empire at all. It was a small beylik, a warrior principality on the fringes of the declining Seljuk world and the weakening Byzantine Empire. Osman, the dynasty's founder, did not inherit vast gold reserves or a sophisticated bureaucracy. What he inherited was opportunity. Borderlands meant constant raiding, constant skirmishing, and constant movement of people and resources. War was not an occasional event. It was the economy. Early Ottoman fighters were rewarded not with salaries from a treasury that did not yet exist, but with land, loot, and status. This matters because from the very beginning, the Ottomans learned a critical lesson. You do not need to be rich to wage war, as long as war itself produces revenue. As the Ottomans expanded into Byzantine territory, they absorbed not only land but administrative habits. The conquered peasants stayed where they were. The farms kept producing. Taxes kept flowing. The Ottomans did not burn what they took. They catalogued it. This was the first financial foundation of Ottoman warfare, conquest that paid for itself. New territories were divided into timars, land grants assigned to cavalry soldiers known as sipahiz. These men were not paid wages by the central state. Instead, they collected taxes directly from the land they were assigned, in exchange for military service when called. The state avoided the burden of maintaining a massive standing army, and soldiers were financially invested in the productivity of their territories. More conquest meant more land to distribute, which meant more soldiers loyal to the system. War financed war, not through gold, but through land and obligation. But land alone could not sustain an expanding empire forever. As the Ottomans crossed into the Balkans and later captured Constantinople, they encountered cities, trade routes, and cash economies. This is where the empire's financial sophistication deepened. The Ottomans inherited Byzantine tax registers, customs systems, and coinage practices, and adapted them rather than discarding them. They minted their own silver coin, the akçe, which became the backbone of imperial finance for centuries. Taxes were assessed carefully, often lower than what previous rulers had demanded, to encourage stability and compliance. Predictable taxation meant predictable revenue, and predictable revenue meant armies could be mobilized when needed without immediate financial panic. At the center of this system stood the Sultan, not just as a warrior king, but as the ultimate financial authority. The Ottoman treasury was not separate from sovereignty, it was an extension of it. Revenue flowed upward from villages to districts, from districts to provinces, and finally to the imperial center. From there, it flowed outward again, funding fortresses, fleets, and most importantly, soldiers who could not be paid with land alone. This is where one of the empire's most famous institutions enters the story: the janissaries. Unlike sipahiz, janissaries were salaried infantry, trained from youth, loyal directly to the Sultan, and paid in cash. Maintaining them required a steady monetary base, which in turn required control of trade, cities, and taxation at scale. For centuries, the balance worked. Expansion brought new taxpayers, New taxpayers funded armies. Armies enabled further expansion. The Ottomans also benefited from geography. Sitting astride trade routes between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, they taxed commerce flowing through their lands. Customs duties, port fees, and market taxes became critical sources of cash. War was expensive, but peace was profitable, and the Ottomans learned to alternate between the two in a way that kept the system solvent. When campaigns succeeded, the influx of loot and tribute eased financial pressure. When they stalled, the empire leaned on its administrative depth to extract revenue without immediate collapse. But no financial system remains stable forever, especially one tied so closely to conquest. By the 16th century, under rulers like Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire reached its territorial peak. From Hungary to Yemen, from Algiers to Iraq, it controlled lands that would have overwhelmed a less organized state. Yet this very success introduced new problems. Expansion slowed, not because the Ottomans suddenly became weak, but because their rivals grew stronger and more technologically sophisticated. Wars became longer, bloodier, and less profitable. At the same time, the costs of maintaining a vast standing army rose sharply. Firearms transformed warfare, and firearms required constant cash expenditure for weapons, powder, and training. Land grants could not easily cover these new costs. Here is where the hidden fragility begins to show. The Timar system depended on continual expansion to create new land grants. When expansion stalled, competition for existing land intensified. Some Sipahis found their incomes shrinking as inflation eroded the value of agricultural taxes. Meanwhile, janissaries, paid in cash, demanded higher wages as prices rose. The state faced a dilemma: raise taxes, debase the currency, or find new revenue streams. In practice, it did all three. Currency debasement became a recurring tool. By reducing the silver content of the oxay, the state could stretch its resources in the short term. Soldiers were paid the same nominal amount, but that money bought less. This worked temporarily, but it also fueled inflation, which in turn increased pressure for higher wages and more debasement. It was a slow spiral, not an immediate crash, and that is why it is often overlooked. The empire did not suddenly go bankrupt. It adapted, improvised, and endured. Another adaptation was tax farming, known as iltizam. Instead of collecting taxes directly, the state auctioned the right to collect them to private individuals, who paid an upfront sum to the treasury. This provided immediate cash, which was especially useful during wartime. But it also shifted incentives. Tax farmers squeezed peasants harder to recoup their investment and make a profit. Rural unrest grew. Productivity suffered. The state gained short-term liquidity at the expense of long-term stability. Again, this was not a collapse, but a trade-off, repeated many times over centuries. As wars with European powers intensified, particularly against the Habsburgs and later Russia, the Ottomans found themselves in a new kind of arms race. Fortifications, artillery, and navies required enormous capital investment. The empire responded by centralizing finance further, expanding bureaucratic oversight, and borrowing indirectly through religious endowments and merchant networks. Unlike European states, the Ottomans were cautious about formal public debt, partly for religious reasons, partly from tradition. Instead, they relied on internal resource mobilization, stretching existing systems to their limits. The breaking point did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrived as accumulation. Military defeats reduced territorial revenue. Inflation eroded trust in currency. Janissaries, once disciplined soldiers, became politicized interest groups, defending their pay and privileges. Provincial elites gained autonomy as tax farming entrenched local power. The financial system that had once turned war into a self-sustaining engine now struggled just to keep the engine running. By the 18th century, the empire was still fighting wars, but the logic had reversed. Instead of war paying for the state strained itself to pay for war. Reforms were attempted. New taxes were introduced, Military units were reorganized. Western-style financial practices were cautiously explored. But each fix ran into resistance from groups that benefited from the old system. Change threatened livelihoods, status, and power. The Ottomans were not ignorant of their problems. They were trapped by them. The 19th century brought the final transformation. Facing existential threats, the empire finally embraced external borrowing, taking loans from European financiers to fund modernization and military reform. This provided short-term relief, but at a high cost. Debt repayments drained revenue. Foreign creditors demanded influence over Ottoman finances. What had once been an internally managed system of war finance became partially outsourced to global capital markets. The empire had paid for centuries of war by relying on land, taxes, and administrative discipline. Now it paid with sovereignty itself. When the Ottoman Empire finally dissolved in the early 20th century, it was not because it had forgotten how to fight. It was because the financial foundations that had supported 6 centuries of conflict could no longer adapt fast enough to a world transformed by industrial warfare and global finance. The mystery resolves itself quietly. The Ottomans survived so long, not by being endlessly wealthy, but by building a system where war, taxation, and administration reinforced one another. They fell when that reinforcement turned into rigidity. So what can we take from this long, winding story? First, war is not sustained by bravery or ideology alone. It is sustained by systems that convert resources into force over time. The Ottomans mastered this longer than almost anyone. Second, financial solutions that work in one era can become liabilities in another. The same mechanisms that enable growth can later prevent adaptation. And third, decline is rarely sudden. It is cumulative, invisible in the short term, and obvious only in retrospect. The warning is uncomfortable. If even a 600-year empire can slowly hollow itself out while appearing stable, what does that say about modern states that rely on complex financial tools to fund permanent military readiness? History does not repeat itself cleanly, but it does echo, especially in the quiet relationship between money and power. If this story changed how you think about empires, war, or the hidden mechanics behind history's biggest events, consider subscribing, because this channel is about pulling those hidden threads until the bigger picture comes into view. And next time you hear about a war being fought somewhere far away, remember the Ottomans and ask the question they answered for centuries before it finally answered them: who is really paying for this? And for how long?